Hi, and welcome to the next video on History of English. In this video, we conclude our block on present-day English by looking at Pidgin and Creole languages and some issues related to this topic. So let's start with a general discussion of what are Pidgin and Creole languages. Okay, so if you remember how we started at the beginning of the semester, you remember that we discussed Old English, for example. We then described the processes and changes that Old English underwent and that led to something that we call Middle English. In Middle English, these processes of change continued and led eventually to the so-called Modern English, early modern and late modern English period. And again, the historical language change processes continued and led ultimately to what we know as present-day English. So what this describes is a historical process that we can continue. We have evidence of, we have texts, documents, and we see the gradual change of the language, which over more than 1,000 years leads to the change of Old English to what we know now as present-day English. When we speak about Pidgin and Creole languages, however, the situation is different. There, we have at least two languages, regardless of what languages they are, language A and language B, that are not mutually intelligible, but whose speakers meet in a very specific situation that leads to the conclusion that they have to communicate with each other, but they don't have any means to do that. So what they do is they basically establish a new language, the so-called Pidgin language, which combines bits of language A and bits of language B, sometimes the grammar, sometimes the lexicon. To a degree, they also evolve completely new structures and properties. Generally speaking, this language, this means of communication is structurally simpler than language A and language B. And the crucial thing is that the Pidgin language has no native speakers, right? Because the speakers using the Pidgin language are native speakers of either language A or language B. But this situation does not necessarily have to remain stable. And if babies are born in this situation who grow up with in an environment where this new Pidgin language is being spoken, these newborn babies may eventually acquire this Pidgin language as their mother language, as their native language, which then leads to the creation of something called Creole language. Right? So Creole language is basically a Pidgin language that has reached such a stage that it already has native speakers. Okay, so this is the basic difference between Creole languages and non-Creole languages. I mentioned that the emergence of Pidgin and Creole languages happens under special circumstances. What are they? Well, there is a series of situation where this, historically speaking, happened. The major situation, the major context for which Creole languages and Pidgin languages are known nowadays is, of course, colonization and the contact between the language of the colonizers with the language of the colonized. This is probably the majority of cases that we know of, but it's not the only possible situation where pidgin languages evolve. We also have so-called maritime pigeons, pidgin languages that evolve when groups of people with different native languages have to communicate, for example, on a ship. And it does not have to be in a colonial context. For example, there was a Norwegian-Russian pidgin language evolved on fishing ships, or trade pigeons. For example, again, the Chinese-Russian pidgin, which evolved in a situation where Russians had to or wanted to trade goods with Chinese speakers in Siberia. Then there are the so-called workforce pigeons. As I said, the most notable example of these are workforce pigeons evolved in a colonial situation, such as plantation pigeons or mine pigeons. But this does not necessarily have to be a colonial setting as well. Then another situation where many people with different linguistic backgrounds meet would be military. So in military contexts, in an army, this happens also quite often in multilingual societies. And also, of course, urban pigeons, sort of situations where people meet in cities through migration, for example, without a common means of communication, leading to the creation of a pidgin language. And if this situation continues, then the pidgin language, as I said, evolves into a Creole language. Okay. So the thing is, I've spoken about Creole languages, about pidgin languages, but what do they really have in what is the thing that makes them so different from non-pidgin and non-Creole languages? So at first glance, they definitely seem different, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't have the term for them. But is it really the case? So the major thing that we obviously use to define pidgin and Creole languages is their origin. The fact that they have a mixed origin. It's not a continuation of an earlier stage of a language, as we've seen with Old English evolving into Middle English, into Modern English and present-day English and so forth. The situation is slightly different. They evolve in a situation where two languages that are not mutually intelligible meet and create something completely new. So this would be the mixed origin. Also, what's important is that we know the contexts of the emergence of these languages. So we know we don't necessarily know the details, but we at least know the place, approximate time, and the social environment. But the thing is, how do we know that this was not the case, for example, for Proto-Indo-European or for Proto-Germanic? And the answer to that is we don't. It might as well be the case that Proto-Indo-European or other older, not documented languages were also pidgin languages and Creole languages. But we simply do not have the evidence for that. So with non-Creole languages, we don't know that much about their origin, whereas with Creole languages and pidgin languages, this happened a lot earlier, and we know how they evolved, therefore. Okay, so this would be one thing. But again, as I said, we don't know how exactly the other languages, non-creoles, evolved. Another thing is, are their structural properties? Because one thing that, at least for pidgin languages, is quite logical, and that the structures that they inherit from the native languages of their speakers is that the structures get simplified, right? Because imagine it is a situation where you need to discuss and communicate about very simple everyday things. For example, in a colonial setting, the two parties involved, the colonizers and the colonized, were obviously not discussing philosophy, but very simple commands. And that also means that the phonology, for example, or morphological structures of the pidgin languages, and later on also of the native Creole languages, are simpler. Another thing is, for example, the somewhat simpler syntax, meaning that pidgin languages and Creole languages very often have a fixed word order. What's also the case is, at least for pidgin languages, that they have a smaller lexicon, which, as I already said, is logical based on the situation in which these languages evolve. However, again, word of caution, this applies to pidgin languages, but does not necessarily have to be the case for Creole languages. Because Creole languages, once they become the native language of someone of a language community, then obviously you have to communicate about more things, about not only about the basic things. And speaking about these structural properties, I would also want to relativize this claim by drawing your attention to a concept known as hidden complexity. So, hidden complexity is a concept that was coined in contrast to the so-called overt complexity. And by overt complexity, I mean, for example, grammatical structures marked explicitly, meaning there are more grammatical marking, morphological or other markings, and it's all less economic in linguistic terms. So, for example, in this case, in English, my brother was going and my brother and father were going. You see that there are two forms of the auxiliary to be, depending on the number. My brother, singular, then was. My brother and father, plural, meaning were. However, if you remember what we discussed when we talked about Appalachian English, there is a sort of leveling of these differences, leading to a situation where you have my brother was going, just as you have my brother and my father was going. So there are no explicitly marked differences between singular and plural on the auxiliary, but in all situations the auxiliary is was. Meaning there is less things marked explicitly. It's more economic because you don't have to have so many markers, but anyway, you know that the one sentence is singular and the other one is in the plural, right? But the difference on the verb is hidden, so to speak. Right? Another example would be, the case of certain nouns in English that are not explicitly marked for plural, but you nevertheless know that there are in the plural, right? For example, 1 sheep, 2 sheep, in contrast to 1 knife, 2 knives. Okay, so this concept was originally proposed by Walter Bisang to describe languages such as, for example, Chinese, that are said to lack morphology, right? And English has also many, way less morphology than Old English, for example. And in case of Chinese and other languages in East Asia, many grammatical properties are not explicitly marked, but they have to be abstracted from the context, right? So the example sentence that I have on the slide can either mean she bought a newspaper or he bought a newspaper. It can also mean she or he bought more than one newspaper, or the newspapers. So definiteness, number, gender, and so forth are not marked. And everything is only in the context. So you could say that it's explicitly, so sort of overtly less complex, but hidden complexity is rather high because you have to abstract so many pieces of information from the context, from the situation. Okay, so this is the basic concept of hidden complexity. And we can also see something like that when we compare Indo-European non-creoles, sort of languages like English, for example, German, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and so forth, with Indo-European based creoles, sort of Creole languages based on those Indo-European languages. And we would then see exactly the thing that I mentioned 2 slides ago, that Creole languages are very often seen as being simpler in their structure, having less morphology, having less complex phonology, and so forth. That might be true on the explicit level, but on a sort of on the level of this so-called hidden complexity, that would not necessarily be the case. So again, a word of caution. Both things that we use to define Pidgin and Creole languages are true, but we have to be careful not to draw an essential difference between these 2 categories, right? So that's important to bear in mind. And in our online session, we're going to see how this works when we discuss one Creole language called Tok Pisin. It's sometimes called Melanesian or New Guinea Pidgin. It has approximately 120,000 L1 speakers, native speakers, and more than 4 million L2 speakers. It's also the official language in Papua New Guinea, the country that you can see on the map on the right-hand side. And it also has varieties known as Bislama and Pidgin, spoken in Vanuatu and on the Solomon Islands, respectively. Again, you can see the flags of these countries. If you're interested in Tok Pisin lexicon, you can have a look at the Tok Pisin English dictionary using the link on the slide. Also, the ABC Australia has news websites in Tok Pisin, and also the so-called One Tok sort of radio program in Tok Pisin. So you can also use the link and have a listen to how Tok Tok Pisin news look like. And the interesting thing would be whether you can actually understand anything, because as I said, this is an English-based Creole, and the lexical material is largely based on English. The grammar is different, but we'll see how that works in our online session, right? And there are also, for example, Vodafone ads in Tok Pisin. Okay, so that was that for our online session on the 31st of January. Please read the preparatory text, have a look at the handout, and try to find answers to the following 5 questions. That was that. Thank you all for listening, for watching, and see you next week. Bye.